Vanakkam. Hello friends. We have been seeing how chieftaincy evolved in ancient Tamil country and how some of the chieftains eventually became more powerful than the others and rose to the position of a Vendan or king, of how they waged war on one another in order to establish their supremacy and power. The chieftains played an important role in the political sphere during the Sangam age. They were a powerful force in shaping the destiny of the three great monarchies, the Cheras, the Cholas and the Pandyas. The history of these native chieftains played a very crucial link in understanding the history and culture of ancient Tamizhagam, points out K.D. Trinavukarasu in his landmark work Chieftains of the Sangam Age. Most of the historical data related to the chieftains are gleaned from the corpus of Sangam literature, and the author has done a thorough work and provides us with a framework for understanding the historic value of Sangam literature. But at the same time, he also points out to a major drawback when it comes to timeline. It is very difficult to determine the genealogy of a particular dynasty. It is equally difficult to understand or arrive at a chronological relationship between chieftains. Chieftaincy led to the emergence of a landowning aristocracy, which in turn led to the emergence of a peasant class. The king rewarded the warrior clan chieftains with lands that were non-productive and in remote areas in return for the services that they rendered. That warfare had emerged as a way of life in the Sangam times is evident from the way Tolgapiyam codified the different phases of war in the Purattineiyal. And we saw earlier how this classification was done around the different stages of cattle raiding. Now, why cattle raiding? It is very interesting to note that cattle raiding was prevalent in all the primitive societies around the world. And these raids formed an important part of folklore and mythology reflected in early literature, in African, Semitic and Indo-European literature. References to cattle raiding are found in the Rig Veda, where the central deity Indra is shown as having played a part. Well, for the nomadic Aryan tribes, cattle equaled wealth, an association impressed on later Tamil society where the Tamil term Maadu literally meant both cattle and wealth. Nestor's cattle raid in the Iliad and Helios' cattle raids in the Odyssey are examples from the Greek side. But it is in the Tolgapiyam and the Sangam literary works that, devoid of any mythological references, cattle raiding is shown as a part of everyday life and is caught in its raw reality, as we saw in a few poems in the previous episode. And Tolgapiyam, with its pragmatic approach, gives a unique treatment under the head Tinai, which means Olukam or discipline, divided into the Agattinai and Purattinai, where the Agattinai stood for matters of the heart, relating to people in one's inner circle of family and relations. Purattinai referred to all the relationship with people other than those in one's inner circle, such as the general public at large, the kings and the warriors. Tolgapiyar, in a stroke of genius, matched the 7 divisions of Ahattinai with 7 divisions of Purattinai, as is shown in the slide below. Thus, Kurinji, Mullai, Marudam, Neidal and Palai, where Kurinji is correlated to Vetchi, Mullai to Vanji, Marudam to Ulingai, Neidal to Tumbai and Palai to Vagai. There are 2 more divisions in Ahattinai, Kaikilai and Perundinai, that are correlated to Padantinai and Kanji. Though explaining the logic behind this is beyond our scope here. Now, what is astounding is that the entire corpus of Sangam literature follows these conventions laid down in Tolgapiyam to a T. And if we were to recap what we have seen earlier, Tolgapiyam precedes the Sangam literature, and the general convention is that grammar follows poetry and hence it is inferred that a huge corpus of poetry must have existed before the days of Tolgapir, as well as works of grammar, as is evidenced by Tolgapir himself, wherein in over 340 places he refers to his predecessors' works by adding the terms Yenba, Moriba, Yenmanar, Pulavar. And so, when cattle raiding forms the basis, that is the kalam for the divisions of Purathineyiyal, one has to understand that it should have existed for many centuries even before the Sangam age. Initially, the king rewarded his chieftain with lands that were very remote and non-productive. But very soon, the chieftains started demanding the grant of fertile riparian lands in return for their services. Sangam literature has numerous references, both direct and indirect, that shows how the kings granted these fertile lands known as Tan Adai Nalgal in Tamil to these chieftains. To quote one song, Purananuru 287, that is titled Kandiro Varave by Satandayar under the Thinai of Karande, which is actually the warriors going to retrieve stolen cattle, under a Thurai known as Neenmori, a subdivision of the Thinai. Here, the poet asks whether fertile fields with fish ponds and paddy would be of any attraction to a warrior in comparison to the celestial maids who will wait upon him if he dies a martyr's death and goes to the heavens. Perhaps there was initially a reluctance on the part of a chieftain to accept these land grants. After all, the free-roaming hunter-gatherer warrior would not have looked kindly to being tied down to a piece of land, nor practicing tilling. Cultivation of the soil was and is backbreaking work. But then, with the fertile lands came power, and this could have been the catalyst that shifted the stance of the warrior hero, making him demand the Marudam lands, as is shown in the Purananuru poem 297. Perinir Meval Tannadai Erume starts this anonymous poem, where the poet captures a scene which is a undatu, a feast on the mead being conducted by a king before the warriors set out to a cattle raid, that is the Vetchithinai. And here the warriors talk among themselves that they were not interested in getting as rewards these remote lands with their wild cows, but would only be satisfied with the grant of the wetlands of Marudam. So land that was nurtured by the Marudam farmers were simply acquired by the king and reassigned to these warriors. And this was the beginning of a quasi-feudal state. Feudalism denotes to a social system that emerged in medieval Europe, where people worked for a higher ranked person, the landed aristocracy, and they in turn were given land and protection. Going by this definition, ancient Tamizhagam had a sort of quasi-feudalism, leading to the formation of what could be called a quasi-feudal state, where you had the kings and the chieftains, the owners of the land on the one side, and the peasant class, the landless laborers on the other. Even among the Velalas, whose profession was agriculture, there was this distinction between landowners and those who toiled in the fields. Feudalism led to fiefdom, where chieftains became vassals, that is, tributaries to a king. Fiefdom refers to a territory of operation controlled by a particular person or group, and a vassal is a holder of land tenure on conditions of homage and allegiance, in this case a chieftain who was a Kurunila Mannan or a Sittarasan. So in this loose feudal setup in ancient Tamizhagam, there was no written agreement between a king and his vassal. Parties were bound by mutual fidelity, one owing protection and the other owing service in return. In Purananuru poem 330 by Nakiranar, the poem goes, வேந்துடை தானே முனைகெட நெறிதர பெருங்கடற்கு ஆழி அணையன் மாதோ. The lord of a small village, a Citrur, fought very valiantly with his drawn sword. When the front lines of the king's army was broken, he stood there single-handedly, and as a bund would prevent the ocean waters from entering the city, he prevented the enemies from advancing. Now, while praising this chief's loyalty and valor, the poet points out how, after having given generous gifts to the Panar, that is the poets, the chieftain was hardly left with any revenue to pay his tributaries due to the king. Now, this was a subtle dig at the king, recommending him to grant a larger area of fertile Marudam plains to the chieftain. The practice of these chieftains reassigning the lands that were gifted to them to the Panars is also recorded in several Sangam poems. Gifting fertile lands would have increased their status and would have elicited more eulogy and praise from the Panars. Perhaps another reason why the chieftains demanded Marudam lands, as captured in the Purananuru poem 302, sung by the poet Veripadiya Kamakanniyar under the Thurai of Thumbai, where two kings met on the battlefield, and under a subdivision, a Thurai known as Kudirai Maram, where the hero goes on a horse. The poet praises the hero and his horse. The poem itself starts with a very beautiful simile. Bedivei kolvadu pola Odithavu buvugalum mave starts the poem. Here, the horse that gallops forward at high speed carrying the warrior at his instance is compared to how a bamboo that is bent back and left free pounces back to its original state. So, lines such as these show how the Sangam poets were astute observers of nature. The poem goes, Panarku okkiya niramba iyalbin karambai chirur நோக்கினர் செகுக்கும் காளை ஊக்கி வேலின் அட்ட களிறு பெயர்த்து எண்ணின் விண்ணிவர் விசும்பின் மீனும் தன் பெயல் உரையும் உரையாற்றாவே. The chieftain with his ferocious spear has killed numerous elephants on the battlefield, and do you know how many? They are more than the stars in the sky and the dewdrops in a rainy cloud, and hence cannot be counted. So these kind of exaggerated praise verses came from the Panars, which elicited generous gifts from the chieftains, and in this case the fertile Marudam lands as well. Purananuru has a number of references to internecine warfare between the kings and the chieftains, brought about because of two reasons: either the chieftains not paying their tribute to the king, that is the kappam, or at times breaking the bond of personal loyalty. Adipatya is a concept where when a king subjugated a chieftain, he did not annex the chieftain's kingdom to his own, but allowed him to rule over his province as an autonomous ruler, but under his overlordship. This introduced a permanent element of instability in the state politic, as the chieftain naturally was always cherishing the hope of overthrowing the imperial yoke. And because of these recalcitrant chieftains, the king had to keep a constant watch over their actions and intentions, as neither could he disarm the chieftains, as he needed their armies for his own purposes. A revolting vassal was a constant irritation and a threat to the king. Powerful chieftains like Nannan, Adiyaman and Malayaman were subdued several times by their overlords. A beautiful simile in a Puram poem compares these recalcitrant chieftains to grains of sand that is caught between the sole of one's feet and one's footwear, which is a constant source of irritation. In this context, it will be appropriate to quote from the Tirukkural, where Valluvar, in a chapter titled Nadu, Kural 735, assigns the term kol, which means to kill, to the term kurumbu, which means a chieftain, calling him kol kurumbu. The Kural goes, Pal kuluvum paal seyyum mutpagayum, வேந்தலைக்கும் கொல் குறும்பும் இல்லத நாடு. A country or a kingdom is that which is free from numerous factions, subversive internal enemies, and lurking murderous petty chieftains who harass the king. Personal devotion, loyalty, and a spirit of sacrifice on the part of the vassal on one hand, and the king's patronage on the other, were the deep and lasting foundations of the feudal setup. In due course of time, the right to rule became hereditary, passing on from father to son, as is captured in a poem by the great Avvayar. In the poem Purananuru 290, a king has had his cattle stolen by the enemy king, and he is throwing a feast with mead, a undatu, for the warriors who are going to embark on a mission to retrieve the stolen cattle. the Thinai here being Karandai, where at this grand Undatu, it was customary for the poet to sing the praises of the warriors going to battle. And here Avayar says, Ivarku ஈத்து உன்மதி கள்ளே சினப்போர் இனக்கழிற்று யானை இயல்தேர் குறிசில் O valiant king, possessing well-made chariots and a large number of elephants, இவர்க்கு ஈத்து உன்மதி கள்ளே, pour this mead first to the warrior chief before even you have it. Do you know why? His father's father protected your father's father in battle, bearing the lance that poked his body, as would the axles in a wheel. Now again, look at the beautiful simile used. And this young warrior too, full of glory and valor, will protect you from the enemy's spears like an umbrella made of the palm leaf that protects you during rain. So in due course of time, the relationship between the king and his chieftains led to different classifications being formed, and K.D. Tirunavukarasu in his Chieftains in the Sangam age identifies about 97 chieftains by name and about 16 tribal heads, and he loosely classifies them into 8 categories. Thus, you have the tribal chieftains and territorial vassals. Tribal chieftains went by their clan names such as Einar, Oliyar, Kalvar, Baradavar, Kosar, Malavar, Vadugar, and many vassals were also known by the territory from which they ruled, such as the Konganar, the Aruvalar, the Erimayurar, and Tondayar. Barons were the landed aristocracy, and Sangam literature enlists 13 Cheras who were powerful landowners such as Ambar Kiran Aruvandai, Nallai Kiran Nahan, and Vallarkudi Kiran. Then came the Ko-Magan, the prince or the son of a king. Some of the names under this category in Purananuru like Azhisi, Thidiyan, Sendan, Kandarakko Perunalli, Sellikoman, Adan Yelini, Velavi Koman Paduman are listed by him. Then come the Velir, the most powerful and well-known of the chieftains, the most popular lords of ancient Tamizhagam, who are mentioned in Tolgapiyam Poruladhiharam in Sutram 636, which mentions that other than cultivating and tilling the soil, they had the right to carry the arms for the king and to wear garlands when employed by the king. The Paditruppathu has 4 references that shows the Velir fighting side by side with the kings, and they also had the privilege of entering into marriage alliances with the monarchs. They had the prefix or suffix Vel attached to their names such as Vel Evi, Vel Avi, Vel Pari, Neduvel Adan, Irungovel, Veliyan Venman, and Nannan Venman. Generals and warriors in a feudal monarchy found a very important place, and we saw earlier how the kings rewarded them by granting them titles such as Yenadi in appreciation of their loyalty and service. There were minor chieftains who ruled the provinces that bordered that of the great kings. These were normally dry lands, and these chieftains were normally assigned the duty of protecting the fortress walls of the king. Hence the term Kurumbu and Kurunila Mannan, as we saw earlier. Kadiya Nedu Vetuvan, Veliman Maran Tittan, Vengai Marban are some of the names mentioned, and Tolgapiyam as one of its Thinai has Ulinge Thinai, which is related to Marudam, with 8 subdivisions, all of which talk about the importance of protecting a king's fortress. The Sangam works also enlist 20 petty chieftains who are noted for their heroics and their munificence, such as Anduvan Kiran, Anduvan Satan, Ayayinan, Kadalan, Pindan, and Atti. The most historic personages described in Sangam literary works, the great chieftains who at a moment's notice were ready to revolt against the king and break their bonds of loyalty, a very powerful force in the political sphere. Some of the more important ones such as Nannan Sei Nannan, Pohuttu Elini, Tondaiman Ilanthireiyan, Kottai Perunan, and Nalliyakkodan. The Kadayelu Vallalgal fall in this category, the last of whom was the great philanthropist Kumanan, who came towards the decline of the 3 great monarchs at the very end of the Sangam age. Thus, in ancient Tamil society, the king was the lord of the land, and he acquired and redistributed the fertile lands to the chieftains, who in turn had the power to redistribute them as gifts to the paners, the poets. and thus evolved a quasi-feudal system. And in due course of time, it became the chieftain's right to demand land and a duty of the king to grant him the land, as is recorded in this very famous poem by the lady poetess Ponmudiyar in Puram 312. ஈன்று புறந்தருதல் எந்தலை கடனே சான்றோனாக்குதல் தந்தைக்கு கடனே வேல்வடித்து கொடுத்தல் கொல்லர்க்கு கடனே நன்னடை நல்கல் வேந்தர்க்கு கடனே ஒளிருவாள் அருஞ்சமம் முறுக்கி களிறு எரிந்து பெயர்தல் காளைக்கு கடனே goes the poem. The poetess says, "My first and foremost duty is to bear a son, a warrior, and to bring him up as a good and noble citizen is the father's duty. The ironsmith's duty is to make him a sharp spear, and it is the lad's duty to take it to war and kill elephants and protect his sovereign." So what is the king's duty? It is to give gifts and acknowledge the service rendered by the warrior. Nannadai nalgal. This has been interpreted by some of the later commentators as good behavior, but of course this has already been assigned as duty to the father. Nannadai nalgal meant the granting of suitable wealth that definitely included the Tannadai, that is the Marudam lands. We will continue to see the workings of the quasi-feudal system of ancient Tamizhagam in the coming episode. Vanakkam.